What if the world is not running out of resources, but running on a myth that says it is? If that sounds interesting, like the video, subscribe, and let's begin. Most people imagine Earth as a warehouse. A closed space with shelves full of oil, metals, water, energy. Every year we take something from those shelves, and one day they will be empty. This image feels natural. It explains fear, prices, and restrictions in one simple picture. The problem is that this picture is wrong. Resources do not exist as ready-to-use objects. Oil underground is not a resource until it can be found, extracted, refined, and transported. Copper inside low-grade rock is not a resource until enough energy and technology exist to make extraction worthwhile. The material was always there. What changed was our ability to turn it into something usable. This is why resources keep running out and then suddenly coming back. What actually disappears is not the substance itself, but the cheap and easy version of accessing it. As soon as prices rise or technology improves, deposits that were once ignored become reserves again. On paper, scarcity turns back into abundance. So when we hear that a resource is ending, what is really ending is convenience. The era of simple extraction. The assumption that nature should be easy. And this is where the narrative quietly shifts. Because if resources are not fixed quantities, but conditional states, dependent on energy, technology, and economics, then the question is no longer how much is left. The real question becomes something far more dangerous. What exactly do we mean when we say resource, and who gets to define it? At this point, the word resource starts to fall apart. Because if oil, metal, or water only become resources under certain conditions, then a resource is not a thing. It is a relationship. A material becomes a resource only when four elements align: the substance itself, the technology to extract it, the energy to power that extraction, and an economic system that considers the result worth the cost. Remove just one of these, and the resource instantly disappears, even though the material remains exactly where it was. This is why scarcity is so difficult to pin down. It is not governed by physics alone. It is governed by thresholds. A copper deposit can exist for centuries without being a resource, and then suddenly become one overnight, not because the earth changed, but because energy became cheaper, machines became better, or prices crossed a certain line. This also explains why resource forecasts fail so consistently. They treat resources as static quantities, when in reality they are moving targets. Every prediction assumes today's technology, today's energy costs, and today's economics will remain fixed. They never do. Once you see this, a disturbing pattern emerges. Resources do not end, definitions do. What we call running out is usually the moment when an old definition stops working and a new one has not yet been accepted. And that gap is dangerous. Because during that gap, scarcity becomes a story, not a fact. A story that justifies urgency, control, and necessary decisions. A story that sounds physical, but is actually political and economic. Which leads to a far more uncomfortable question. If resources are defined, not discovered, who benefits when those definitions stay narrow, expensive, and exclusive? If the idea of scarcity feels convincing, it is because we have heard it before. Many times. For oil. For coal. For copper. For rare earth metals. For food. Each generation is told that it will be the last one to have access to something essential. And each time, the prediction fails. In the early 20th century, experts warned that oil production would peak within decades. In the 1970s, the world was told that fossil fuels were nearing irreversible decline. Similar claims were made about copper in the 1960s, about food supply in the era of population panic, and more recently about lithium and rare earth elements. The pattern is always the same: a fixed timeline, a looming collapse, and an urgent need to act. What actually happens is quieter. Cheap sources decline. Easy extraction ends. Existing infrastructure reaches its limits. And instead of saying, Our methods are no longer sufficient, the narrative shifts to, the resource is ending. Then prices rise, investment increases, new technologies emerge, and deposits that were once considered unusable suddenly become viable. Scarcity dissolves, until the next cycle begins. This does not mean resources are infinite. It means that scarcity is relative, not absolute. It appears when systems lag behind reality, not when matter vanishes. But here is the critical detail. Every time this cycle repeats, it leaves something behind. Not more abundance, but higher complexity, higher costs, and tighter control. Access becomes harder. Infrastructure becomes centralized. Entry barriers rise. So even when the resource comes back, it does not come back equally for everyone. Which raises a far more uncomfortable realization. If scarcity keeps disappearing physically, but intensifying socially, then maybe scarcity is not a failure of prediction, but a feature of the system itself. And once that possibility appears, the story is no longer about geology or technology. It becomes a story about who needs scarcity to exist, and why. At this stage, scarcity stops looking like a misunderstanding. It starts to look useful. Because the idea that resources are running out does more than describe reality, it shapes behavior. It creates urgency without requiring proof. It makes restrictions feel natural. It turns political and economic decisions into technical necessities. When prices rise, scarcity explains it. When access is limited, scarcity justifies it. When control increases, scarcity makes it unavoidable. The key advantage of the scarcity narrative is that it sounds physical. You cannot argue with geology. You cannot negotiate with nature. If something is ending, then sacrifices are not a choice, they are a duty. And once a problem is framed this way, questioning the solution becomes irrational, even dangerous. But notice what rarely gets discussed. Scarcity is almost never used to reduce complexity. It does not lead to simpler systems or shared access. Instead, it consistently produces more layers, more intermediaries, more regulation, more centralized infrastructure. The system does not shrink, it hardens. This is because scarcity is not just a condition. It is a filter. It determines who is allowed to participate and who is priced out. Who is considered efficient and who is deemed wasteful. Who adapts and who is excluded. And the most effective part is this: you do not need scarcity to be real. You only need it to be believable. As long as people accept the premise that resources are ending, they will accept solutions that would otherwise be questioned. Not because they agree, but because they see no alternative. Which leads to the most dangerous implications so far. If scarcity functions as a tool of control rather than a description of reality, then the real limitation is not resources themselves, but access to them. And once access becomes the issue, the conversation shifts again, away from nature and directly toward power. Once access becomes the focus, a strange contradiction appears. We live in a world where production capacity is higher than ever, extraction technologies are more advanced than ever, and global output continues to grow, yet scarcity feels more permanent, not less. This is not a failure of resources. It is a feature of how abundance is handled. Modern systems are not designed to distribute resources evenly. They are designed to optimize flow, profit, and control. As complexity increases, so do barriers. Infrastructure becomes expensive to build, difficult to maintain, and impossible to replicate locally. The resource exists, but participation requires permission, capital, and integration into the system that manages it. This is why abundance does not remove scarcity, it reorganizes it. Energy can be plentiful, but access is mediated. Food can be overproduced, but distribution is selective. Water can exist in massive quantities, but purification and delivery determine who can use it. Scarcity is no longer about absence. It is about gatekeeping. And the more advanced a system becomes, the easier it is to justify this gatekeeping as efficiency. Centralization is framed as necessity. Exclusion is framed as optimization. Those without access are no longer deprived, they are simply outside the system. This is where the myth completes its transformation. Scarcity stops being something that happens to us, and becomes something that is maintained. Not maliciously, not secretly, but structurally. It emerges naturally from systems that prioritize stability and control over universality. And once scarcity is embedded this deeply, removing it becomes dangerous. Because abundance threatens not resources, but hierarchies. Which leads to the next and most uncomfortable step. If scarcity persists even when resources are available, then perhaps the system is not protecting resources from people, but protecting itself from too many participants. At this point, the logic becomes difficult to ignore. If scarcity persists even when materials exist, technologies improve, and production grows, then scarcity is no longer about nature. It is about selection. Modern systems do not primarily limit oil, water, energy, or food. They limit who is allowed full access to them. The constraint is not geological, it is structural. Infrastructure, regulation, pricing, and complexity act together as filters, determining how many participants a system can tolerate without destabilizing itself. This is why scarcity scales with population and connectivity. The more people capable of participating fully, the more pressure the system experiences. Not because resources vanish, but because control becomes harder to maintain. Scarcity, in this sense, functions as a pressure valve. It slows inclusion. It enforces hierarchy. It keeps participation manageable. And this reframes many familiar ideas. Efficiency is no longer about reducing waste, it is about reducing access. Sustainability is no longer about protecting nature, it is about stabilizing systems under strain. Even innovation often serves to increase complexity rather than openness, raising the cost of entry instead of lowering it. None of this requires coordination or conspiracy. Systems evolve toward states that preserve themselves. Scarcity emerges naturally as a regulating mechanism, not because materials are gone, but because unrestricted access would dissolve existing structures. This is the moment where the narrative breaks. If the real limitation is the number of people who can meaningfully participate, then the myth of running out of resources serves a deeper function. It disguises exclusion as inevitability. It turns structural decisions into natural laws. And once you see this, the final question becomes unavoidable. If scarcity is used to regulate participation, then what happens when even participation itself becomes too expensive to maintain? If resources are not disappearing, and scarcity is used to regulate participation, then the real limit is not physical. It is systemic. What begins to run out is not oil, water, or energy, but cheap inclusion. The ability for large numbers of people to meaningfully participate without destabilizing the system. As complexity rises, systems require more coordination, more control, more filtering. And each layer makes participation more expensive, more conditional, and more selective. This is why the future feels constrained even when technology advances. Progress does not remove limits, it relocates them. Instead of nature saying, no, the system does. Access becomes a privilege of compatibility, financial, technical, institutional. Those who cannot integrate are not crushed, they are simply excluded. In this context, the myth of running out of resources performs its final function. It reframes systemic limits as natural ones. It shifts responsibility away from design choices and toward inevitability. If the problem is nature, then no one is accountable. If the problem is structure, then everything becomes negotiable and unstable. And this is the real tension we avoid naming. Because if resources are still there, and scarcity is a tool rather than a fact, then the question is no longer about survival. It is about what kind of system we are preserving, and who it is built to sustain. Maybe nothing is running out. Maybe what is ending is the illusion that everyone was ever meant to be included. And once that illusion fades, the future stops being a technical problem, and becomes a moral one, whether we acknowledge it or not.